My name is Maeve Lassiter. I am 40 years old, a retired major in the United States Army, and today I want to talk to you about something we rarely discuss openly. I want to talk about the silent, invisible architecture of a family. I want to talk about what happens when the people who are supposed to carry your story are the very ones who spend a lifetime trying to erase it. Go ahead and pour yourself a cup of coffee. Pull up a chair. Let's just sit and talk for a moment, because if you are tuning into this, chances are you know exactly what it feels like to be filed away. You know the precise, suffocating weight of being assigned a role in your own house. The dreamer, the outsider, the one who never quite amounted to anything, and realizing that no matter what you achieve out there in the world, the version of you that lives in your family's mind will never change. Have you ever given everything to the people you love, only to find out they were using your silence to fund their own illusions? If that hits home, if you've ever had to build a boundary from absolute scratch just to survive the people who raised you, do me a favor. Pause right here. Hit that like button, subscribe, and type the word boundaries in the comments section below. Let me know where you are watching from. It helps me know I'm not just talking into the dark, and more importantly, it reminds the person reading your comment that they aren't alone in the quiet corners of their own life. For 22 years, I let my family believe I wrote a desk overseas. I let them believe my time in the uniform was spent in a well-lit office, pushing papers, filing forms, and taking myself far too seriously. I did it because it was easier. I did it because the true story, the real terrain of roads that wanted me dead, of burning metal and things you cannot unsee, did not fit on my father's kitchen table. It didn't fit into the narrow, comfortable margins of the script they had written for me before I was even old enough to vote. And for 12 of those years, I silently carried them. I was the financial foundation under their house, the load-bearing wall that nobody knew was holding the roof up through catastrophic winters, medical bills, and failing businesses. I did it from thousands of miles away, routing money through my mother so my proud father would never have to look at my name on a check. I paid in dollars and in silence for the simple right to sit at their holiday tables and let them introduce me as somebody else. Someone smaller. Someone useful, but never truly wanted. But then came a clear, cold morning in March of 2026. A morning where my own sister stood up in a room full of strangers, uniformed personnel, and high-ranking officers and decided to turn my entire life into a punchline. She didn't know that the chain of command had spent years reviewing what happened on a dark road on the 19th of October, 2012. She didn't know that a major general was holding a piece of paper that would pull my true self out of the shadows. We are going to get into exactly what happened in that hall and how the entire room changed with a single order. But before we go back to that morning, I need to show you the math of where I came from. I need to take you back to the River Road, to the smell of diesel and cedar, and to the absolute certainty that if a thing couldn't be counted in plain sight, my family would refuse to believe it existed. The civilian rows at a military ceremony have a very specific sound. It is a loose, restless murmur of shifting fabrics, program fans, and whispered logistics. People wondering where they are supposed to eat lunch afterward or how long the speeches will take. But the formation itself, the deep sea of service uniforms pressed into perfect alignments, is completely silent. It is a breathing wall of discipline, a heavy anchor of stillness that sets the tone for everything else in the room. I sat in the front guest row, set off to the right side of the main formation. My uniform felt heavy on my shoulders, heavier than it usually did. Every medal, every ribbon pinned to the left breast of my jacket represented a specific, unvarnished true thing. But that morning, The one that felt like a hot coal against my chest was the small bar of purple bordered in stark white. The Purple Heart. It was the medal this country gives you when you have left your own blood on a road somewhere else. A quiet receipt for a transaction you never wanted to make in the first place. My family sat right beside me. My mother was next to me, her fingers nervously twisting her purse strap, while my father sat tall, his hands resting on his knees like two blocks of weathered pine. And then there was Delia. Delia had driven down with her husband Hayden, and she had brought two of her local friends along, treating the entire event like an interesting weekend road trip or a curiosity to watch and have opinions about later. I could feel her eyes on me, or more specifically, on the uniform. In all the years I had worn it, through every tense holiday dinner and brief leave, she had never once asked what the ribbons stood for. She looked at them the way she looked at an elaborate, slightly ridiculous costume I had chosen to put on to make myself feel important. As the chatter in the hall began to settle, and the presiding officer stepped up to the microphone, Delia leaned across the narrow aisle toward her two friends. She didn't whisper. Delia had spent her entire life mastering a very specific kind of carrying voice. The kind of stage whisper that was engineered to be overheard by everyone in a 3-row radius while maintaining the plausible deniability of a private remark. "A Purple Heart? Please," she said, her voice dripping with that familiar, casual amusement I had run away from at 18. She paid for that ribbon. The closest Maeve ever got to a war was watching the evening news from a desk in Qatar. Beside her, Hayden gave a short, wet snort, shifting his heavy frame in the folding chair. "Let her have her little ceremony, Dee," he replied, not bothering to lower his voice either. "Some people need the titles to feel big. I want to pause right here and ask you something. Have you ever felt that specific, localized freeze in your chest? It is the cold of being called a thief of the one thing you paid for most dearly, in the one currency you can never get back. I have been shot at. I have had a heavy armored vehicle literally come apart around me in the dark. I have heard the metallic screech of shrapnel cutting through a cab, but none of that prepared me for the precise clinical cruelty of my own sister, informing a room full of strangers that I had purchased my wounds with cash. My vision narrowed to the edge of the speaker's podium in front of me. Every instinct I possessed as an MP officer told me to maintain control, to keep my posture rigid, to protect the perimeter of my own skin. I didn't turn around to face her fully. I didn't raise my voice. I had spent 2 decades learning how to hold far worse things together than a broken family dinner, in far worse places than a climate-controlled hall, so I simply turned my head just enough so that she alone could catch the level, quiet frequency of my voice, and I said, "You can believe whatever you need to, Delia." Then I faced front. Because Major General Stephen Cardwell had just stepped to the microphone, and he was adjusting his glasses to read the official citation. I hadn't told my family who he was. I hadn't told them he was a 2-star general now, or that he had commanded our entire division during that bloody rotation in 2012. I had stopped trying to explain my life to them a very long time ago, because every true sentence I handed them was immediately sanded down into a punchline. But as Cardwell cleared his throat, the carrying whispers behind me suddenly died out, and the silence of the formation rushed in to fill the gaps. To understand why my sister felt so comfortable turning my service into a transaction, you have to understand the house we grew up in. You have to understand the specific, unyielding arithmetic of my father, Arthur Lassiter. We lived in a logging town, folded deep into the Coast Range of Oregon. A place where the timber-covered mountains came down so close to the back fence, it felt like they were trying to push us into the river. The rain stayed 3 seasons. out of 4, a heavy, gray dampness that soaked into the wood of the porch and the fabric of your coat until everything you owned felt slightly weighted down. 2 miles up the river road ran the local sawmill, and on still mornings, before the log trucks started gear shifting down the highway, you could hear it from our kitchen table. It was a low, industrial breathing, under the birdsong, a heavy whir-whir-whir that served as the heartbeat of the entire valley. Every evening at exactly 5:40, my father came home from that mill smelling of cedar, diesel, and something slightly burnt. To him, and consequently to everyone under his roof, that smell was the physical scent of worth. If a thing made my father smell like that, it counted. If an activity resulted in a visible product, a pile of split cordwood, a finished line of fence posts, or a stack of clean cash, it was real. If it did not, if it was something that lived in the mind or required time spent away from physical labor, he had a way of looking right past it. It wasn't a cruel look. It was worse than that. It was an empty glance, a total blankness that taught you everything you ever needed to know about where you stood on his ledger. My sister Delia was 3 years older than me, and she was 3 years better at everything that showed to a man like Arthur Lassiter. She had what the neighbors called a porch-light smile. She could turn it on the exact way you flip a switch on a dark veranda, and grown people would immediately lean toward her without even realizing they were doing it. On Saturdays, when our parents set up a roadside stand to sell wild blackberries, Delia could stand out front with the wooden cash box and charm 2 flats of berries into the hands of a passing stranger before I had even finished counting out the correct change for the first customer. She was always the one in the front of the family photographs, her smile perfectly caught, while I was always the girl at the very edge of the frame, slightly out of focus, as if the camera hadn't quite decided whether I belonged in the family portrait or not. They called me the dreamer, and in a logging town where survival depended on physical labor, they did not mean it kindly. I remember a specific morning when I was 9 years old. I was sitting at the kitchen table, completely absorbed in drawing detailed maps on sheets of scrap paper. They weren't maps of our valley. They were maps of completely imaginary places. Rivers I had named myself, jagged mountain passes I had invented, each adorned with a tiny, carefully drawn flag to mark a safe harbor. My father walked in from the mill, his lunch pail heavy in his hand, and he stopped behind my chair. He looked down at my drawing for a long, silent moment. For one foolish, racing heartbeat, I thought he might ask me about the rivers. I thought he might want to know where the flags led. Instead, he set his heavy aluminum lunch pail down on the counter with a loud, metallic clatter that made my pencils roll. He didn't look at my face. He just looked past the paper toward the window and said, "You can't bank a daydream, Maeve. Watch your sister." Through the glass, we could see Delia out front by the roadside stand, organizing the cash box, doing the kind of work he could see, count, and understand. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply folded my hand-drawn map in half, and then in half again and again until it was a tiny, tight square small enough to disappear completely into the deep pocket of my jeans. I got very good that year at making things small enough to disappear. I didn't know it yet, but I was practicing for the rest of my life. I was learning how to take my true self, my ambitions, and my achievements, and shrink them down so they wouldn't cause a scene at a table that had no room for them. It wasn't that Delia was explicitly cruel to me in those early years, though. That is the part that took me the longest to understand, and it's something I want you to consider if you're dealing with your own family dynamics right now. When we were small, she was, in her own particular way, kind to me. She braided my hair before school, when my mother's hands were too stiff from the damp morning air. She let me sleep in her bed during the loudest of the winter storms, when the wind came roaring down off the ridge and made the whole house creak like an old wooden ship. She even fought a boy once in the 3rd grade for calling me strange, coming home with a torn sleeve and a bruised lip, refusing to say why to our parents. I loved her with the helpless, absolute way a younger sister loves the older one she is built to look up to. The trouble was never that she hated me. The trouble was that, somewhere along the way, she came to believe the family story about me as completely as everyone else did. And a person who loves you while believing you are less than you actually are will wound you in ways an enemy never could, because you keep handing them the knife yourself. You trust them with your vulnerabilities, and they use them to reinforce the boundaries of the small cage they've built for you. That was the structural blueprint of our family, and I learned it early. A thing only counted if you could set it on the physical table and look at it. A dollar counted. A finished fence counted. A cord of split wood counted. Delia's pageant ribbon counted the year she was 18 and got crowned at the county fair. We all drove out to watch her, and we stood in a photograph where I was somehow, as always, at the very edge of the frame, a little out of focus. The girl the camera had not quite decided to include. What nobody noticed that night at the fair was that I slipped away for 20 minutes while they were celebrating around the funnel cake stand. I walked down past the livestock barns where the smell of hay and animal sweat was thick, toward a folding table, under a buzzing fluorescent light where 2 soldiers in pristine, pressed uniforms were handing out brochures. I didn't take a brochure. I just stood at a polite distance, looking at the sharp, clean lines of their posture, reading the metal words pinned to their chests. And I felt something in me go quiet and certain, in a way it never did at home. These were people who had clearly done things you could not necessarily see from a roadside stand, yet they carried themselves like those invisible things still counted anyway. I was 15 years old. I didn't have the sophisticated words for it yet, but I understood down in my bones that I had found the far edge of my father's map, and I was going to walk off it. But I told no one. In our house, you did not announce a plan. You waited until the plan had become an unalterable fact, because a plan was just a daydream with better posture, and we did not bank daydreams. So I kept my grades up in the quiet, invisible way I did everything. When the letter finally came offering a full scholarship through the Army's officer training program, I had already filled out every single line of the paperwork at the school counselor's office, without mentioning it at the dinner table once. The first my family heard of it was the week I had to give the school my final answer. My mother cried a little in the kitchen, in the careful, suppressed way she did everything when my father was in the next room. Delia, home from her first year at the local community college, looked at me as though I had announced I was moving to the moon. "You in the Army?" she said. It wasn't unkindly, exactly, but it had that small, dismissive laugh underneath it. The laugh that said she could not quite picture it, that it didn't fit the sister she had filed away in her mind. I was 18. On a gray morning in the late summer of 2004, I loaded a single duffel bag into the back of my mother's car. My father stood on the porch with his coffee, watching the steam rise into the damp air. "Running off to play soldier," he said. It wasn't a question. He said it the way he might have said running off to join the circus. A thing that happened to other people's daughters. A temporary phase that wouldn't stick. Delia came out in her robe and hugged me, and even then, I noticed the particular quality of that hug. She hugged me the way you hug a guest who has finally decided to leave. Warm, a little relieved, already thinking about how she would redecorate the room she was getting back. I drove away thinking I would go and become someone, and then I would come home and set that someone on the table. And Finally, my father would look at me the way he looked at a finished fence. I thought recognition was a thing you earned once and carried home in a box. I was 18, and I was half right, which is the most dangerous thing a person can be. The army took the quiet girl who drew imaginary maps and made her into someone who read real hostile terrain for a living. I commissioned in 2008 and branched into the military police corps. Within a single year, I was a second lieutenant, learning the harsh reality that the part of war nobody puts in the movies is the road. It is the slow, unglamorous, high-stakes work of route security, convoy operations, and casualty collection points. It means moving heavy supplies and human lives across ground that wants to kill you. It is a world that does not photograph well. It is exactly the kind of gritty, dangerous, methodical work my father would have deeply respected if it had been happening at the timber mill, and exactly the kind he simply could not picture happening to his youngest daughter. I learned the anatomy of a road. I learned the exact way a culvert can hide an explosive device, and the way a too-quiet village street tells you something is wrong before your eyes can even process the threat. I learned to be responsible for the lives of other people in a way that permanently rearranges your psychology. And I was good at it. I was steady under pressure in a way that surprised the very men who outranked me. I came home on leave between deployment rotations and tried, the first few times, to bring a little bit of that reality back to the family table. It never landed. Take Thanksgiving of 2010, for example. I was a first lieutenant, fresh off my first overseas rotation, still carrying the physical hypervigilance of the deployment in the rigid set of my shoulders. Delia brought the man she was about to marry to dinner. Hayden was a local regional contractor with a booming voice, a heavy handshake, and a physical way of filling a doorway. Delia steered him right toward me, turning on her signature porch-light smile, and said, "Hayden, this is my little sister, Maeve. She does army paperwork or something over there." I opened my mouth. I felt the air hit the back of my throat, ready to explain what my platoon actually did, how we cleared routes, how we secured high-value assets, how we kept people alive. But Delia, sensing the shift, instantly put her hand on Hayden's arm, laughed that light, musical laugh of hers, and said, "Don't make her explain it, babe. It's all just forms and filing over there anyway." The table laughed. It was a comfortable, easy sound, and I, tired from the travel, exhausted by the sudden transition from a combat zone to a suburban dining room, just let it stand. That was my first real warning, though I did not possess the psychological tools to read it as one at the time. I had started doing the very thing that would cost me the next 16 years of my life. I had started answering for myself in their language. I was shrinking my own life down to fit the narrow story they had already agreed upon, simply because the false story was easier than the exhausting argument. Every single time I let it stand, I taught them that their small version of me was the truth. I just didn't understand yet that I was the teacher. Let me ask you right now, as you listen to this. Are you doing the same thing? Are you playing small at family dinners just to keep the peace? Are you funding their comfort with your own erasure? If you are, let this be the moment you notice the price you are paying. Delia and Hayden married the following year, in the summer of 2011, the exact same month I pinned on my captain's bars. I came to the wedding in my dress uniform because my mother had specifically asked me to, her voice small and pleading over the phone. She wanted the family to look complete, to look respectable in front of the groom's extended family. I spent most of the reception standing near the back of the white canvas tent, out of the direct sun, wearing my crisp blue uniform with the fresh silver captain's bars gleaming on my shoulders. I felt entirely out of place, A soldier dropped into a sea of pastel dresses and champagne flutes. As I stood there, an older woman whom I had never met walked up to me, smiled pleasantly, and handed me a large, empty silver serving tray. She looked at my uniform, looked at the trim alignment of my jacket, and asked if I could please head back to the kitchen to refill the grilled shrimp before the cocktail hour ended. She honestly thought I was with the catering staff. The formal dress uniform of a United States Army captain looked to her like nothing more than a high-end hospitality outfit. And I didn't correct her. I want you to hear that clearly. I didn't say, "Actually, Mom, I'm a combat officer." I didn't point to the insignia on my collar. I just took the heavy silver tray from her hands. On my way to the kitchen tent, I happened to pass the head table and noticed that the seating arrangements had been miscalculated. The groom's side was 2 chairs short, and Hayden's mother was already beginning to look deeply slighted. Instead of letting a scene ruin my sister's wedding, I quietly tracked down the event coordinator, moved 2 chairs from the back row, rearranged the place cards, and fixed the entire crisis before anyone else even noticed it was happening. And then, I went into the kitchen and refilled the shrimp tray. Why did I do it? Because by that point in my life, it was simply easier to perform the invisible labor than to spend 30 minutes explaining to a room full of strangers who I actually was. It was easier to disappear into their expectations. When I finally went back out into the main tent, I watched my father. He spent the entire evening trailing behind Hayden, introduces him to every local businessman and timber client who had traveled up the river road. He talked loudly about Hayden's commercial contracting business, Hayden's new turbo diesel truck, and Hayden's ambitious plans to build a fleet of storage units out toward the state highway. Before the band had even finished their first set, I saw my father clap Hayden on the shoulder. With a heavy, open palm, the exact kind of proud, validating physical clap I had spent my entire youth wishing to receive. He called him son before the night was over. I watched Arthur Lassiter be intensely proud of a man he had known for less than 12 months. It was a pride that came completely easy to him, because Hayden's version of worth was the kind you could physically see, measure, and park in a driveway. Standing there by the catering doors with a tray in my hand, I understood with total freezing clarity that my captain's bars meant absolutely nothing to my father. To him, they looked like a costume. Military rank was a thing you wore. It wasn't a tangible asset you could set on the kitchen table and count. It didn't smell like diesel or cedar. It didn't make a noise he trusted. I had gone out into the world and built a life of real heavy responsibility, but back under the canopy of my family's approval, I was still just the dreamer at the edge of the photograph, holding a tray of shrimp at her older sister's festival. The last door I left open was a phone call in the spring of 2012. I was weeks out from a deployment I could already feel was going to be different. Heavier, more unpredictable. Some stubborn, childlike part of me still wanted one person in that house to know what my job actually entailed before I stepped onto the aircraft. I called my mother. I started carefully to describe route security, explaining what it meant to be the officer responsible when the heavy convoy rolled out into the dark and how the lives of every single soldier in those vehicles became, very literally, my personal responsibility. But as I spoke, I heard Delia's voice in the background, home for a casual weekend visit. She was speaking in that bright, caring, performance-driven voice of hers. "Tell Maeve she's gone all serious. My God, she always does this." And my mother, meaning it entirely as comfort, said, gently into the receiver, "You don't have to make it sound so dramatic, honey." I held that plastic phone in my hand, listening to the static on the line, and I understood something with total, absolute clarity. There was no version of the truth I could hand this family that they would not immediately sand down into something smaller, safer, and easier to keep on the low shelf where they had already decided I belonged. The problem was not that they lacked the information. The problem was that they had a story, and that story was load-bearing for their own comfort. Any truth that threatened it would simply be filed away as me being dramatic. So I stopped trying. I shipped out in the early autumn of 2012 with that tidy little story trailing behind me at home. And then I went and lived the raw part they had spent 8 years refusing to believe on a dusty road in the dark on the 19th of October. It took the military almost 14 years to put a proper name on what happened on that road. When it finally did, in the form of a service-wide Valor Review that upgraded my recognition to a Bronze Star, with the bronze letter V for Valor, they held the formal ceremony on a clear, cold morning in March of 2026. I was 40 years old and a major by then. I had a uniform with a chest full of ribbons, and for reasons I am still untangling, I had invited them. It wasn't pride. It was that same old hope, worn incredibly thin over 22 years, but never quite dead. The hope that if the recognition came from someone they could not dismiss, in a setting they could not reduce to paperwork, maybe my father would finally look at me the way he looked at a finished fence. Now, Major General Stephen Cardwell stood at the microphone. He looked out over the sea of silent uniforms, adjusted his glasses, set the program down, and picked up the official citation. The room held its breath as his unhurried voice cut through the silence of the hall. For wounds received in action and for gallantry on the night of the 19th of October 2012, he read, the words bouncing off the high concrete walls. When, though twice wounded by an improvised explosive device and subsequent small arms fire, then Captain Lassiter returned to a burning vehicle to recover 2 soldiers pinned within it, organized the defense and the casualty collection point under continuous enemy fire, and refused medical evacuation until every soldier under her command had been moved to safety. The hall was very, very quiet. The kind of quiet where you can hear the building itself settle. The kind of quiet where a casual lie has nowhere left to hide. The sound of the general's voice reading those plain, unvarnished sentences seemed to alter the very air pressure inside the hall. The words twice wounded and burning vehicle hung in the space above our heads, heavy and undeniable, refusing to be sanded down or tucked away into a convenient drawer. And then, exactly 2 rows back from where my family was sitting, a sergeant first class stood up. I didn't even have to fully turn my head to know exactly who he was. I knew the rhythm of his movements before I saw his face. Wyatt Coburn had been a young specialist of 22 on that dusty road in 2012, one of the 2 men whose bodies had been pinned under the mangled dashboard of that burning truck. Today, he was a grown man of 36, with thick streaks of gray coming in at his temples and 2 children waiting for him at home. He came to his feet and snapped to attention without anyone giving an order. His eyes fixed straight ahead, and he spoke into the vast silence of the room. His voice wasn't a shout, but it possessed the clear, carrying weight of an absolute fact. "She came back for me, ma'am," he said, the words cutting right through the space where my sister sat. "Twice." Then another soldier stood up on the far left side of the formation. Then a whole row of them. Then, in the unmistakable way a wave moves through a disciplined military formation, every single person in a service uniform inside that hall rose to their feet and snapped to attention. It was a standing sea of blue and green, a massive wall of living respect, and not one single pair of eyes in that room was looking at my sister Delia. They were looking entirely at me. For the first time in my 40 years of life, I was the thing in the room that counted. And the undeniable proof of it was an entire hall of combat veterans and officers standing on their feet. They were standing for the exact story my sister had spent 20 years calling a dramatic lie. They were standing for the work my father had decided didn't exist because it couldn't be parked in a driveway. As I rose from my chair to step forward and receive the award from the general, I let myself glance, just once, at the people who shared my last name. My mother had both of her hands pressed tightly over her mouth, her shoulders shaking with a quiet, repressed sob. My father was staring blankly at the standing rows of soldiers around him, his jaw slightly slack, wearing an expression I had never once seen on his face in my entire life. It was the look of a master carpenter whose trusted measurements have just failed him on a build. The look of a man whose unyielding arithmetic had completely stopped adding up in front of his eyes. And Delia? Delia was sitting completely still, frozen in her folding chair while the rest of the world stood up around her. She was the only civilian in her entire row who had remained seated, surrounded by a standing wall of uniforms. The porch-light smile was entirely gone. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the floor, and she had finally, completely, gone quiet. General Cardwell pinned the Bronze Star with the V device onto my jacket, and as he stepped back, he didn't just salute and walk away. He took my hand, holding it a beat longer than the official ceremony required, his jaw working once as he looked at me. "Look, just between us," he said, his voice dropping low enough that only I could hear it over the ringing silence. "I scrubbed your launch that night. Did you know that? The weather was entirely below minimums. I told the whole radio net to hold." He took a slow breath. "You went anyway on your own call, and you brought my soldiers home. And I have thought about that choice every single day for 14 years. He let go of my hand and took a half step back, his eyes steady. "It is the greatest honor of my career to read that citation aloud today, Major." I had not known that. I had carried the memory of that dark road for 14 years, secretly believing that the heavy chain of command above me had simply filed it away into some administrative cabinet and forgotten it. And here was the two-star general who had given the order I disobeyed, telling me, in front of the very people who had minimized me, that my choice had been the only right one. There are recognitions you wait your whole life to receive from the people who owe them to you, and they never arrive. And then, sometimes, a true one arrives from a direction you never thought to watch. I did not say a single word to my sister when the ceremony ended. I didn't need to. I walked straight to the front of the hall, shaking hands with the officers and veterans who lined up to speak with me, leaving my family to navigate the crowd on their own. The truth was already out, already standing on its own 2 feet, already in uniform and filling every single corner of that massive room. It didn't need any petty commentary or defensive help from me. Marisol Vega found me asphalt afterward in the asphalt parking lot outside the battalion headquarters because, of course, she did. She had driven 6 long hours across state lines to be there entirely in secret without ever telling me she was coming. She stood by the driver's side door of my car in civilian clothes, a faded denim jacket and boots, with her arms crossed over her chest. This was the exact same woman who had tied a tight combat tourniquet on my bleeding upper arm in the pitch black on that road in 2012, back when she was a 25-year-old sergeant and the only medic left standing on her feet after the blast. We didn't go to a fancy restaurant to celebrate. We went to a small, weathered diner just outside the post gates, the kind of place with sticky laminated menus, bottomless pots of lukewarm coffee, and a tired waitress who calls every soldier Han without looking up from her notepad. I carefully set the small velvet case containing my new medal onto the Formica table between our mugs, and out of an old, deeply ingrained reflex, I started to make it small. I started to tell her that it was a long time ago, that the Valor Review was probably just the military clearing through an old administrative backlog, that it really wasn't that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. Vega reached out and placed her hand flat on the table. She didn't slam it down, but she did it with a quiet, solid force that stopped the words right inside my throat. "I tied off your arm in the absolute dark, Maeve," she said, her eyes locking onto mine with the intense, unblinking focus of a combat medic. "I held that wound shut with my own bare hand because we were completely out of medical gauze. And I was not going to sit there and watch you bleed out on a dirt road. You do not get to sit here in this diner and tell me your life was just paperwork." She stared at me for a long, heavy moment over the steam rising from our coffee cups. "Who taught them it was?" she asked bluntly. I couldn't answer her right away. I looked down at the dark liquid in my mug. "Your family," Vega said, answering her own question when the silence stretched too long. "I watched your sister's face the entire time Major General Cardwell was reading that citation aloud. She wasn't shocked because she suddenly found out you were brave, Maeve. She was shocked because she found out that everyone else out here in the real world already knew it. She had decided exactly who you were a long time ago, and she never expected to be the absolute last person in the room to learn she was dead wrong about it." "She's always been like that," I muttered, offering up the exact same defensive excuse I had been using to justify my family's behavior for 40 years. "Sure," Vega countered quickly, her voice sharp with a medic's precision. "And who let her stay like that? Who refilled the empty shrimp tray at her wedding, Maeve? Who answers? How's the army, with just a casual busy? I have known you for 15 years. You would run headfirst back into a burning tactical vehicle for a total stranger without a half second of hesitation. But you won't correct your own sister at a holiday dinner table." She wasn't trying to be cruel to me. She was a combat medic naming the wound out loud so that it could finally be cleaned and treated. "You didn't just let them lie about you all these years," she added softly. "You funded it." That single word, funded, landed somewhere deep inside my chest and stayed there like a piece of shrapnel. Because she was entirely right, and because I knew, deep down, that I had an exact number attached to it. Late that night, back in the quiet safety of my quarters, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, so I did the one thing I always do when the trouble feels too overwhelming. I decided to make it concrete. I decided to set it on the table where I could physically look at it. Arthur Lassiter's daughter to the very end. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and a black pen, and I spent the next 3 hours writing down 12 years of hidden history. I wrote down the exact amounts of money I had wired directly to my mother to pay off the medical bills she was too proud to mention out loud. The ones my father's basic timber insurance didn't cover, stretching all the way back to 2019. I wrote down the loan, the real one, the $18,000 in cash I had quietly injected into Hayden's commercial business through one catastrophic winter when his crews were completely idle and his bank was circling like a vulture. I had routed that money entirely through my mother's personal account so that his pride would never be wounded, so he would never have to know the cash had come from the sister who did forms and filing. I added up the flights home for holidays I dreaded, the lavish gifts I bought to compensate for my physical absence, the financial standing in for a daughter who was away serving her country. When I totaled the numbers at the bottom of the page, the final sum made me sit back hard in my desk chair. But the number wasn't the real point. It was the shape the number made. For 12 years, I had been the family's secret foundation, the invisible load-bearing wall holding up their roof, while they spent every single dinner telling each other that I was the one who had never amounted to anything. I called my mother the next morning. I do not honestly know what I expected from her. Perhaps some slight crack in the family story after what she had witnessed with her own eyes in that hall. But what I heard underneath her words instead was embarrassment, a low, crackling static of it. She said it had been quite a morning and that the general's reading had been a lot for everyone to process. And then she said, very carefully, that Delia felt I had turned the ceremony into a whole scene, that I had put her in an incredibly awkward spot in front of her local friends. I held the phone to my ear, listening to her breathing, and I understood that the family had already met. In the silent, telepathic way families meet without ever scheduling an actual conversation. They had already filed the entire morning away under the one heading that protected their comfort best. And that heading was not that they had been entirely wrong about me for 20 years. The heading was that Maeve had embarrassed Delia. I had walked into a burning tactical vehicle twice to save human lives, and in my family's final accounting, the primary offense of the day was that I had allowed a 2-star general to read aloud exactly what I had done. I got off the phone gently. I did not argue, and I did not raise my voice. But something deep inside me, the invisible load-bearing wall, the thing that had been silently holding up their roof for 12 years, finally set down its load. And for the very first time in my adult life, I felt it stand up completely straight. I am a military police officer. My entire 22-year career has been built on one single foundational idea, that a boundary is not an act of cruelty. A boundary is simply a line drawn clearly and held without anger. And it is the most humane thing you can possibly offer to people who have somehow learned that there are no lines around you. I had spent 20 years drawing lines on the ground for other people, holding gates, checkpoints, and rules of engagement, steady so that everyone on both sides knew exactly where they stood. And yet, I had never once in all that time drawn a single line around myself. I decided to draw it with a letter. I sat down at the small table in my quarters and wrote it longhand, making myself draft it the exact same way I would draft a military operations order. I wrote it completely without heat, because an operations order written in anger is an order that gets people killed on a road. I did not catalog their past failures. I did not include the final number from my yellow legal pad. I wrote that I loved them, which was the absolute truth. Then I wrote that for many years, I had quietly provided financial and structural support that I had never once mentioned out loud, and that I was going to stop. I explained that I wasn't doing it to punish anyone, but because providing that safety net had required me to make myself small, and I was entirely finished being small. I enclosed a single detached paragraph, the official, releasable summary of my military service. The plain sentences describing who I actually was and what I had actually done. I did it so that they would have the unvarnished truth in writing, whether or not they ever chose to open the envelope and read it. And then I set one term, just one. I wrote, I am not asking you to be proud of me. I am asking you to be curious about who I am before you decide who I am. That is the only thing I want from you, and it is absolutely not negotiable. Then I drove down to the post office and mailed it before I could talk myself into sanding the sentences down into something smaller, safer, and easier for them to swallow. Delia called within the week. I let it go straight to voicemail the first time because I wanted to ensure I was completely steady before I picked up the phone, and then I called her back on a quiet afternoon. She came out swinging immediately, the exact way she always had whenever she felt challenged, but I noticed there was something entirely new vibrating underneath her anger. A thinness. the distinct sound of a person who has suddenly felt her footing shift on a slope. "So this is how it is now," she demanded, her voice rising through the receiver. "We all have to bow down to you because the army decided to give you a pin? You send mom and dad a letter written like some kind of lawyer? You are punishing this entire family over a piece of metal, Maeve?" "Not bow," I said, keeping my voice down in that low-level frequency I had practiced. "Just ask. In 40 years, Delia, you never once asked me what I actually did. You never once asked what the purple heart on my chest was for. You decided on your own that it was nothing, and then at a formal ceremony being held to honor it, you told a row of total strangers that I had purchased it with money. I am not punishing you at all. I am simply not paying for it anymore." "Paying for what?" she snapped back, her tone genuinely defensive. "What on earth are you even talking about, Maeve?" And in that exact moment, listening to the raw confusion in her voice, I realized that she genuinely did not know. None of them did. That was the cleanest, most devastating possible evidence of how thoroughly invisible I had made myself under their roof. I had held up their ceiling for 12 years, routing cash through the dark, and they didn't even know there was a wall standing there to begin with. They thought the roof stayed up by magic, or by their own merit. I did not tell her the number over the phone. It would have sounded like a petty bill. And this journey was absolutely not about a financial bill. It was about a boundary. But within the month, Hayden found out the exact part that touched him, because unspoken things have a way of coming due precisely when the spigot goes dry. The quiet emergency financial backup simply stopped, and the cold, unyielding math underneath his business finally surfaced to the top. He called me 3 weeks later, and his big doorway-filling voice had a distinct wobble in it that I had never heard before. He tried to smooth it over, to charm me, to find the exact angle that would keep the line open. "We have always been family, Maeve," he said, his voice dropping into a low, confidential rumble. "You know I would do the exact same thing for you if you ever needed it." It was an outright lie, and the heavy silence on the line proved that we both knew it. "I do know, Hayden," I said gently, because there was no tactical reason to be cruel to a frightened man whose ledger was collapsing, and I am glad I could help you when you needed it. I am simply not able to do it anymore. That was all. I did not lecture him. I did not remind him that he had snorted at my little ceremony 4 weeks earlier in that concrete hall. I just closed the door quietly, slid the bolt into place, and let him stand on the other side of it, with the cold air that his own choices had let into his house. My father said absolutely nothing for an entire week after the letter arrived, and then he left a single voicemail on my phone. It was not an apology. It was 40 seconds of a grown man clearing his throat over the static, his breathing heavy, saying that he had read the thing the general sent down from the headquarters. And then he said, his voice dropping into a register I had never heard before, that he didn't rightly know what to do with it. There was a long, agonizing pause where the line just breathed between us, and then he muttered, "Call your mother." That was the entire message. But for Arthur Lassiter, a man who had measured every single ounce of his life by what he could see, hold, and count in plain sight, the simple fact that he was openly struggling to process something he could not see was the very first crack in the wall he had spent 40 years building around the idea of me. I held the line. The drawing of that boundary had taken only a single letter and a stamp, but the actual holding of it took every single ounce of psychological strength I possessed. Because every single day, some old, deeply trained part of my brain wanted to pick up the phone and completely undo it. Some part of me wanted to run back home, refill the shrimp tray, make the family soft in my mind again, and volunteer to be the invisible wall again. Because even if the wall was unappreciated, at least the wall had a recognized place in the house. But I didn't crawl back. I held it. The holding was the brutal part, and nobody was ever going to stand up and give me a medal for it. And that was, in its own strange way, the most honest thing I had ever earned in my life. Here's the thing that nobody tells you about drawing a clear line in a toxic family system. Once you finally stop holding a roof up, you find out exactly what that roof was resting on, and then you have to stand there in the yard and watch the building settle without running back inside to catch the beams. The true story of the award ceremony traveled across the county entirely on its own. The way stories do in a small timber town where everyone has known everyone else for 3 generations. I had absolutely nothing to do with its spread. A retired first sergeant named Dotson had been sitting in the hall that cold morning. He was an old soldier who made it a point to attend every single ceremony on that post, because he firmly believed that someone from the old days should always be sitting in the rows, witnessing, so that the young ones knew their sacrifices still mattered out here. He had heard the general read my citation word for word, and he had seen the entire formation snap to attention around my family. And it turned out that Dotson did his weekly shopping at the exact same hardware store my brother-in-law Hayden used for his business. When Dotson happened to overhear Delia in the aisle one Saturday afternoon, loudly telling some twisted version of that morning that somehow managed to make the entire event about her own personal embarrassment, the old soldier didn't just ignore it. He set down the box of deck screws he was holding right onto the shelf and corrected her in public, using the plain, flat, unyielding voice of an old non-commissioned officer who had long since run out of patience for nonsense. I heard about the interaction later, secondhand, the way I now heard everything about my hometown from a careful and deliberate distance. He had looked her right in the eye and said, "Ma'am, I was standing in that hall. They do not read a citation like that for an administrative clerk. Your sister was twice wounded by an explosive device, and she went right back into the fire to drag her people out of a burning truck. You might want to actually learn the story before you go around telling it to people." And then he had paid for his items and walked out, leaving the people in the store standing in total silence. That was how a town that had spent 20 years quietly agreeing with my family's accounting of me began, just as quietly, to revise its books. I did not gloat when I heard about what happened at the hardware store. I want to be entirely precise about that with you, because it would be an absolute lie to sit here and tell you that I felt nothing. I felt a sudden flush of something hot and old course through me, the deep animal satisfaction of the unseen finally being seen, of the record finally being corrected in a public place by an old soldier who had absolutely no reason to lie for me. But I had learned enough hard truths by then to know that satisfaction is not the same thing as peace. And I understood that, after all of it, I was only really after the second thing. My mother called me a few weeks later on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, and for the first time in my entire life, she did not have an agenda. She didn't call to ask for help. She didn't call to report on Delia's dramas, and she didn't call to smooth over a rough patch. She just wanted to talk. She sat on the other end of the line and asked me, in a very small voice, what the road had actually been like on that night in October. And for the first time in 20 years, I didn't give her the sanded-down version. I told her a little bit of it. The parts a mother's heart could hold without breaking. She was quiet for a long time, the line humming between us, and then she said, "I used to tell the neighbors you had a desk job, Maeve. I told them that because it was so much easier than admitting to myself that I didn't actually know what my own daughter did out there in the world." She paused, her breath catching. "I am deeply ashamed of that, honey. It wasn't a full, complete reckoning from the whole family, and we both knew it, but it was the first time in 2 decades that anyone under that roof had used a word that brought me into the center of the frame instead of pushing me to the dark edges. I held on to that sentence. Meanwhile, Hayden's construction business began to visibly strain without the quiet underwriting it had been leaning on. For the better part of a decade, it wasn't because I had actively attacked him or tried to ruin his life. It was simply because I had stopped catching him. It turned out the business had been falling for years, and I had been the only person in the world quietly putting a safety hand under it every winter. His loud bluster had finally met cold arithmetic, and arithmetic does not care in the slightest how strong your handshake is or how well you happen to fill a doorway. I felt for him distantly, the way you feel for a stranger in a sad book, but I did not move a single inch to help. Marisol Vega called me in the middle of all this and offered, in her blunt medic's way, to drive out to the logging town herself. She wanted to go set the record straight, loudly, making sure the right people in the family heard the full truth in unmistakable, aggressive terms. She would have done it, too. She would have considered it a great use of a Saturday afternoon. But I told her no. I do not want them humiliated, Marisol, I said, and as the words came out of my mouth, I realized the absolute truth of them. I spent my whole life wanting them to see me. I never once wanted them on the floor. Those are not the same thing. Saying it out loud to her, I understood that the old Maeve, the one who had refilled the shrimp tray, had secretly carried a Cirksame Saudamater. Fantasy of a day when her family would be humiliated into finally seeing her, dragged to the truth entirely against their will. But somewhere in the long, unglamorous holding of that quiet boundary line, I had stopped needing the room to turn around. The truth was going to carry itself now on the legs of an old first sergeant, a standing formation, and an official citation written in plain sentences. It didn't need me to push it down anyone's throat. Delia's first real attempt at a genuine apology came in May, and it was entirely the wrong one, which forced me to refuse it. It turned out to be one of the hardest things I have ever done with a completely clear head. She actually drove all the way down to the military post, a thing she had never done once in 18 years. We sat together on a wooden bench outside the visitor center, two sisters in our 40s who had not actually talked since we were young girls. She looked at her hands and gave me an apology that was, from the very first word to the last, entirely about herself and her own social circle. "I am so sorry it all blew up like that," she muttered, her voice shaky. "It was just so embarrassing, Maeve, for everybody involved. The way it happened right in front of all those people and my friends. I really should have handled the morning differently." As she spoke, I realized she was apologizing exclusively for the optics of the day, for having been caught in a lie, and for the temporary social discomfort of that morning. She was not apologizing in any way for the underlying contempt she had carried for 40 years. I had practiced for this exact moment because Marisol Vega had warned me it would arrive in exactly this shape. So I did not let myself get angry. I let her finish completely, and then I said, "Delia, that is not the apology. The apology is not for how the room looked. The apology is for deciding who I was for 40 years and never once having the curiosity to ask the truth. It is for looking at this ribbon at 20 different family dinners and never wondering, not one single time, what your little sister bled for. I do not need you to grovel to me. But I am absolutely not going to accept an apology for public embarrassment when the actual wound you inflicted was contempt. If you genuinely want to fix this, you have to first actually want to know me. That is the price of admission to my life, and there is not a smaller one available." She didn't have an answer for that. She had come prepared to smooth a superficial thing over, and you simply cannot smooth over a boundary that demands to be respected and understood. She left that day without the relationship being fixed, but she also left with the price named plainly out loud between us, and that was further than the two of us had ever gotten in our entire lives. The first week of June, my mother called and asked me to come home for dinner. "Just a quiet dinner," she said softly. "No special occasion." I drove the river road past the timber mill, where the saws were screaming through the first heavy logs of the morning, exactly the way they had all through my childhood, and I turned into the driveway of the house I had loaded a single duffel bag out of 22 years before. The very first thing I saw when I walked through the front door was the living room wall. My father had hung my framed citation there, the bronze star with the V for valor, and right beside it, in its own custom frame, he had placed my Purple Heart. He hadn't tucked them away in a back hallway or hidden them in a spare bedroom. They were hanging right there in the main room, side by side with his own things. They were resting right next to the worn hand tools from the mill that had hung on that wall my entire life. The old chisels, the wooden folding rule, and the steel framing square. The things he could see, and the things that had always counted as real worth in his house. My invisible work and his visible work, side by side, finally under the exact same light. He had made physical room for me in the one place in that house where human worth had ever been measured. He didn't say a single word about it when I walked in. He just stood by the kitchen counter and watched me see it. And that, coming from Arthur Lassiter, was the greatest speech he could have ever given. While we were setting the table, an old neighbor from down the road, Mrs. Pruitt, stopped by the open front door to return a glass casserole dish, and Delia went to answer it. I stood in the dining room and I heard my sister introduce me to the neighborhood. She did not say, "This is my little sister." She did not say, "She does paperwork or something over there." She stood tall in the open doorway with the evening light behind her, and she said in a clear, unblinking voice, "This is my sister Maeve. She is a major in the United States Army. She was wounded over there, and they gave her a medal for going straight back into the fire to bring her people home." I had waited 40 years to be introduced correctly by a member of my family, and when it finally happened, it was so plain, so quiet, and so entirely ordinary. Just one true sentence spoken over a casserole dish in a doorway, but it carried so much weight that I had to turn my back to the room and pretend to organize the silverware just so nobody would see my face change. We ate dinner together. It was not a perfect dinner, and it would be a lie to tell you otherwise. There were still careful, quiet places in the conversation, topics we all consciously stepped around. A broken family, learning an entirely new way of being a family in late middle age, which is a clumsy and slow thing to watch people attempt. But for the first time in our lives, the table was resting on a foundation of absolute reality. At one point, Delia turned to me and asked an actual question about my daily logistics, and then she sat completely still and listened to the actual answer all the way to the sentence's end. And that had quite simply never happened before in the entire course of our lives. I want to leave you today with the one thing I understand now that I didn't understand at 18. Driving away down that damp river road with a single duffel bag, certain that I could earn my way into being seen. You can buy almost anything in this world that looks like proof. You can buy ribbons, you can buy titles, and you can buy the whole glittering appearance of a successful life. My sister, in her cruelest and most defensive moment, accused me of buying the one thing that cannot ever be purchased on this earth. And the beautiful, terrible joke buried right underneath her cruelty was that she had the math exactly backward. You cannot buy the dark night that put that purple ribbon on my chest. You cannot buy the physical weight of 2 wounded soldiers carried out of a burning truck under enemy fire. And you cannot buy back the long, silent years that somebody chose to look past you at a kitchen table. None of those things are for sale in either direction. They can only be earned through fire, and they can only be given through grace. But here is the part of the journey that turned out in the end to be entirely enough. You can be asked, finally, after 40 years of silence. You can be asked who you are, and you can choose to look at them, open your hand, and say yes. They see the soldier now in that concrete hall. They see her at that dinner table, and they see her framed on that living room wall. I had spent so much of my life waiting to be seen by them that I had very nearly forgotten that she had been right here the entire time anyway, doing the heavy work that nobody was watching and quietly becoming the exact person they had all sworn she would never be. They see her clearly now, and the strangest, quietest, most liberating gift in all of it is that I no longer need them to. I would simply now rather that they do. Thank you so much for staying with me all the way to the very end of this one. If Maeve's story meant something to your own journey today, please take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them, and I am deeply grateful that you are here in this quiet corner with me. Until next time, take care of yourself, hold your lines steady, and never be afraid to stand straight.